I'm wondering this morning, once Zechariah got his voice back, did he sing his song to his son John? Did he tuck him in at night singing, "Now bless the God of Israel who comes in love and power"? Did he hold John in his arms and sing, "And you, child, will be called the prophet of the Most High, for you will go out to prepare God's way"? Of course, there's no way of knowing, but I do wonder. I do imagine. What we do know is from the continuation of the story in Luke, which is also printed in your bulletin this morning. This son of Zechariah, John, went into all the region around the Jordan, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. As it is written in the book of the words of the prophet Isaiah, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, "Prepare, you will go out to prepare God's ways." Zechariah's song for his son is, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make God's paths straight. Every valley shall be filled." Cue the Messiah music, right? "Every valley will be filled, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked made straight, and the rough places plain. And all flesh shall see it together." All flesh shall see the salvation of God. You know, sometimes I can't say these words or hear them without the music going along. Leave it to George Frederick Handel to weave together Malachi and Isaiah and Luke so beautifully that we are lulled into a sense of comfort. Does it give any of you pause that this Sunday's Advent text seemed to associate being prepared with being purified? That bother any of you? You know, being prepared by itself is bad enough. I have this recurring dream, maybe you have this dream too, where I've been cast in a play, and somehow it never occurred to me to memorize my lines. And this realization just dawns on me as the curtain is about to go up. Do you know this dream? I'm not alone in this, right? I wake up in a panic. I call this my preparation panic dream. There is a pastor friend of mine who likes to tell me when I'm obsessing about a sermon, "Oh, just wing it." Now, I will tell you that for me, there are fewer frightening words in English than "just wing it." Would not want my surgeon to live by that motto. Perhaps the reason I have never had any interest in being a Boy Scout is their motto, "Be prepared." Because I will admit that I suffer from preparation panic. Whether asleep or awake, I have this anxiety about being prepared. So when Luke tells the story of John and quotes Isaiah about a voice calling out in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord," I get chills, and not in a good way. Worse, putting these texts together with Malachi's words about being purified makes it sound like being prepared has something to do with being pure. And that is really unnerving. In fact, however, both the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition have movements that teach the way to be prepared for the coming of Messiah or the return of Jesus is to be pure and to create a purified community. Marcus Borg, who wrote that book that we're using in adult learning along with John Dominic Crossan, says that in Jesus' time, purity was also central to two Jewish renewal groups in first century Palestine. the Pharisees sought the extension of the more stringent priestly rules of purity into everyday life. And the Essenes withdrew to the desert wilderness along the Dead Sea, believing that purity could be attained only by isolation from the impure world of culture. Jesus, Borg says, stood against these purity movements that imagined being prepared for the coming fulfillment of the Messianic age or the reign of God was a matter of creating a pure community. See, Jesus saw the isolation and exclusion and superiority and the polarization of those purity systems as a threat to the deepest meaning of the reign of God. Ironically, the followers of Jesus in the centuries after his life seem to have forgotten this message. Amen? They forgot. See, I grew up among Christians who believed that being prepared for the return of Jesus meant living every day of our lives in moral and social purity, separated from the world. I remember my dad trying to explain to me why it was that we didn't go to movies. He said that we, meaning me, wouldn't want to be found by Jesus in a movie house. My response was that maybe it depended on the movie. That did not help. My dad is an example of those who throughout the history of the church have believed that there is an absolute connection between being prepared for the coming of Christ and purity. And that concern, not surprisingly, recreated the very kind of communities that Jesus rejected. Communities of isolation and exclusion and superiority and polarization. In fact, I think you could track all of those apocalyptic movements, those end-time movements, as attempts to connect being prepared with being pure. Even in our vaguely spiritual Christmas culture, we get some of these messages. You better watch out. You better not cry. You better not pout. I'm telling you why. Santa Claus is coming to town. He's making a list and checking it twice. Gonna find out who's naughty or nice. Santa Claus is coming to town. He sees you when you're sleeping. Is that kind of creepy to you? He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good. So, be good for goodness sake. See, you've got the message already. Somehow being prepared and being pure has gotten connected in our spiritual psyche. And I think one of the issues this creates for us is that we have come to see being prepared and being pure as states of being. Do you know what I mean? That somehow we can claim to be prepared or to be pure. I was reading an article by a Lutheran pastor, Peter Marty, who quotes Martin Luther as saying, "This life is not righteous, but growth in righteousness, is not health, but healing, not being, but becoming. The process is not yet finished, but it is going on. This is not the end, but this is the road. All does not yet gleam in glory, but all is being purified." And Marty points out that Luther is writing this at about the time that he's to be excommunicated from the church. Now put those two things together. A church that's worried about its state of purity. One that wanted to make sure that all those heretics didn't do anything to stain the theology and was willing to exclude and to do worse to any of those who threatened that purity. So I'm guessing the Luther story also illustrates how purity can become a matter of control and power. Marty goes on to say, Luther's contention that the Christian life is forever an unfinished product didn't sit well with the powers that be. He was excommunicated from the church within months of writing these words. Being prepared and being purified are not states of being. They are becoming. They're not a product. They're a process. You know, airplane rides are always threatening to me. Not because of what happens in the air, but because of who's sitting next to me. If I'm reading something that looks vaguely Christian, sometimes someone will turn to me and say, "Are you a Christian?" And that's a good day. A bad day is when they say, "Well, what kind of Christian are you?" A really bad day is, "What do you do for a living?" Oh, no. So it's awkward when people ask me if I'm a Christian. It's awkward because of the expectations. It's awkward in part because being identified as a Christian these days is associated with a lot of things that feel antithetical to what I know of the teachings of Jesus. Mm-hmm. Yes. Amen. But it's also awkward because it doesn't seem to me that Christianity is a status, exactly. It's not something completely achieved. Along with Luther, Pastor Marty quotes the great poet Maya Angelou, who says, "I'm working at trying to be a Christian, and that's serious business. It's not something where you think, oh, I've got it done. I did it all day. Hot diggity." I'm sure that's how Maya would say it. The truth is, she says, all day long you try to do it, you try to be it, and then in the evening, if you're honest and you have a little courage, you look at yourself and say, I only blew it 86 times. Not bad. I'm always amazed, she says, when people walk up to me and say, I'm a Christian. I always think, already? You've already got it? My goodness, you're fast. You've probably noticed that our theme for this season, as we're preparing for the promise of Christmas, is already, not yet. And if you ask me if I'm a Christian, I think I would say, well, yes, and not quite yet. It's not a state of being, it's a commitment I make to a process. And I think there is an important humility in that. It's a resistance to the isolation and exclusion and superiority and polarization that can happen when being prepared for something like the reign of God becomes a status connected to purity. But it isn't just about humility. It's about hope. It's about recognizing that being is also becoming, or as Luther says, all does not yet gleam in glory, but all is in the process of being purified. Many years ago, when my parents and I were struggling with the truth about my life, I started to despair that we would ever have a relationship again. Let me be clear that part of that was that they were afraid for me. They believed that I could not be prepared for the return of Jesus or for my own death while I was living in that impure state of homosexuality. We would go for long stretches without talking, without any communication at all. And then one day, I got a card in the mail from my mom. I was suspicious. I had gotten cards before. This one had a simple Bible reference written by my mom at the bottom, and I could tell it was her handwriting. It said simply, Philippians 1:6. That's it. Philippians 1:6. Now, my mom knew that I was prepared by all those years of memorizing Bible verses to recognize what that meant. You know what the verse says? I am confident of this very thing, that the one who has begun a good work in you will bring it to completion. And you know what? I was not prepared for that. I was not prepared for my mom to make that shift from purity as a state of being to the process in which everything is on its way to its own completion. I was not prepared for this confidence to come from my mother's side of the conversation, that I could hope again. And of course, everything did not magically change. There were still a lot of difficult days ahead, but it was an opening. It was a place to begin again. It was hope. An already and not quite yet moment of love in our life together. You know, I wonder, when George Frederick Handel wove together the texts of Malachi and Luke and Isaiah, did he have the book of James in mind? You remember the book of James, the series we did over the summer, where James says, pure religion. Pure religion and undefiled is this, to care for orphans and widows. I wonder, because those early performances of Handel's Messiah were benefits for hospitals caring for abandoned infants and children, and relief for those who were in prison because of debt. It is reported that 142 prisoners were released from jail, and I quote, their debts having been paid through the proceeds of those performances. Wow. And this, are you ready? And this, after religious leaders of the day wrote articles about how profane Handel's work was, the Bishop of London even forbid the performance of Messiah on the grounds that it would be sinful to represent biblical characters in a theater. What is it about theater? While church leaders were concerned about a state of purity, Messiah was calling out charity, supporting the care of infants and children, and freeing debtors from prison. Messiah was preparing its way with compassion. Being prepared for the promise of Christmas is not some state of being prepared or purified. It's saying yes to a process that's held together by humility and hope and the kind of love that is already and not quite yet. At about the same time, Handel was writing Messiah, and the Church of England was struggling with its own sense of purity. Charles Wesley, good old Methodist, wrote, love divine, all loves excelling, joy of heaven to earth come down, fix in us your humble dwelling, all your faithful mercies crown. See, in the middle of their everyday lives, an angel appeared to Mary and to Zechariah and gave them what seemed like unlikely news. New life was being born in them. They were not prepared. There were all kinds of questions about how the purity of all this worked out. But ready or not, they said yes. They were willing to live in that tension of a love that was already and not quite yet. Fix in us love's humble dwelling, they said. And today, if you hear that voice, this time, today, if you hear your voice saying, yes, I'm not prepared. Yes. For God's sake, I'm not pure. Still, yes. Today, if you hear that voice, for your sake, for God's sake, for the world's sake, do not harden your hearts.